Good morning. My name is Barbara Fuller, and as Chair of the Board, I welcome you to this March 18th, 2025 working session of the Washtenaw County Board of Road Commissioners. Our Office Coordinator, Aaron Smith, will describe how our meetings operate, how to access the agenda packet, and how people may participate remotely. Aaron?
Thanks, Chair Fuller. There are multiple ways to make public comment during today's working session, whether you're joining us in person or virtually. If you're here in person and would like to make comment, please fill out the sign-in sheet now. If you're joining us virtually, we will ask you to raise your hand at the appropriate time in the agenda. If you're joining us virtually and are experiencing technical issues with audio or video during the meeting, submit a comment in the chat feature and we will help you troubleshoot. If you would like closed captioning during this meeting, you'll have to manually change your settings. Click on the captions button and select show captions. The audio and video of this meeting is being recorded and a link to the recording will be posted to our website in the next few days. There are printed copies of today's meeting agenda on the table near the front door, and it's also posted on our website. And now I'll turn it back over to Chair Fuller.
Thanks, Aaron. I now call this March 18th, 2025 working session to order and ask Aaron to call the roll.
Chair Barb Fuller,
Present.
Vice Chair Rod Green,
Present.
Commissioner Gloria Yamas,
Present.
Commissioner Joanne McCollum,
Present.
and Commissioner Jeff Smurs.
Present.
And then the following directors are in attendance: Managing Director Matt McDonald, Assistant Director of Engineering Aaron Burkholz, Director of Operations Adam Lape, and Director of Finance Dan Ackerman.
Thank you. I now ask for a motion to approve the agenda as presented.
So move.
Second.
Any additions, deletions, corrections? Seeing none, Aaron, if you would, please.
Commissioner Rod Green,
Yes.
Commissioner Joanne McCollum.
Yes.
Commissioner Gloria Yamas.
Yes.
Commissioner Jeff Smurs.
Yes.
And Commissioner Barb Fuller.
Yes, the agenda is approved as presented. Next item on our agenda is a period for public comment. This is the time set aside on the agenda to receive comments from the public. This is not intended to be a period for dialogue. Each person will be allotted 3 minutes to address the board, and Aaron will explain how people may be recognized to offer comments.
Thanks, Chair Fuller. Since this is a hybrid meeting with both in-person and virtual attendees, we will take turns between those attending in person and virtually. For virtual attendees, we have provided some instructions on the screen on how to participate and make comment. If you're attending this meeting virtually and would like to make comment, please raise your hand now. If you dialed into the meeting from your phone, you can raise your hand by dialing *9. We will unmute virtual participants with raised hands one at a time, and we'll announce your username or the last 4 digits of your phone number when it is your turn to speak. And then please share your name and address before beginning your comments. And then for our in-person attendees, we will start with those who have signed up on the sign-in sheet as you walked in. If you didn't sign in, you're still welcome to make comment. We'll notify you when it is your turn.
Thank you. Do we have anyone who wishes to make comments?
No, Madam Chair.
All right, we will move on with our working session agenda. This time I will turn the meeting over to Matt McDonald, Managing Director of the Road Commission. Matt.
Thank you, Chair. And I will quickly introduce Craig Timmer, who's going to run through a CPR demonstration for us this week.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Craig Timmer, Safety Coordinator here for the Road Commission. Was invited today to do a quick review of CPR skills. For most of you, this is refresher training. But as any good instructor, I brought a video along to do most of the talking for me. Just a few highlights of why we're going to learn what's known as hands only or compressions only CPR today. It's kind of what's being geared toward the lay person or the average first responder, someone that may come upon an emergency as it happens. It's quick and easy to learn, and it puts aside all those fears and inhibitions of doing mouth-to-mouth respirations or rescue breaths for a victim. It's strictly hands only, compressions only CPR. So there is a handout sheet that has some statistics on it. This is for someone who's gone into cardiac arrest, which is kind of thought of as the heart short circuiting. It's not pumping blood efficiently through the body. Every year, around 350,000 people here in the United States suffer a cardiac arrest just in the United States. So survival for them depends immediately on immediate CPR rather. And we will watch a quick video. It's about 2 minutes long to learn and refresh our skills on hands-only CPR.
Thanks, Craig.
To perform hands-only CPR. Cardiac emergencies can happen anywhere. Be prepared with a simple technique known as hands-only CPR. You can learn it in minutes, it's easy to remember, and it can help save a life. You will need the willingness to act and a few simple skills. Whenever possible, use disposable gloves when providing emergency care. Step 1. If you see someone suddenly collapse, check the scene for safety and then see if the person responds to you by tapping them on the shoulder and shouting, "Are you okay?" Step 2. Briefly look for breathing. Step 3. If they don't respond, call or send someone to call 911 or the local emergency number right away. Step 4. If the person is not breathing or is gasping, prepare to give chest compressions. Kneel beside them and put the heel of one hand on the center of their chest. Place your other hand over that hand, lacing your fingers together. Position your shoulders directly over your hands, keeping your arms straight and your fingers off the chest. Step 5. Push hard and fast, at least 2 inches. Then let the chest rise completely before pressing down again. Don't take your hands off the chest, just your weight. Step 6. Keep going. Do not stop compressions until the person shows an obvious sign of life like breathing. The scene becomes unsafe. An automated external defibrillator or AED is ready. You're too exhausted to continue, or a trained responder takes over. Step 7. Get training and encourage others to do so by taking an American Red Cross health and safety course. Knowing full CPR, chest compressions, and breaths will enable you to help in other emergencies such as drowning and choking. Every household should have at least one person trained in life-saving skills. Did you know? Most people who survive a cardiac emergency are helped by a bystander. To find your local Red Cross chapter, visit redcross.org.
All right. It's pretty quick and easy to learn. Just 2 steps, basically dial 911 or have a bystander, someone that's nearby, dial 911 and then push hard and fast in the center of the chest. Right around 100 compressions or 100 beats per minute is what you're aiming for. There's a laundry list of songs out there that are 100 beats per minute. The famous one is "Staying Alive" by the Bee Gees. But like I said, there's a laundry list on both the American Red Cross website and the American Heart Association websites to kind of help you get that rate locked into your head. I do have mannequins available that we could practice on. I'll set those up at my desk over in the administrative wing. So if you want to get some hands-on experience in doing that or just refresh what it feels like for those hands-on skills, I'll be in my cubicle all morning, and I would invite you to come over and check it out.
Craig, could you update the board on the type of training we provide for our staff?
Sure.
As well.
We do a full American Heart Association CPR course, as well as a first aid course. The first aid section is required by MIOSHA. So to maintain compliance with MIOSHA standards, we offer that to our employees. I think we are in excess of 90% of our employees are first aid and CPR trained now. And then also within the past couple of weeks, I became certified as a stop the bleed instructor for massive hemorrhage type injuries. So we'll be including that into our first aid and CPR courses as well.
And we have AEDs at all our facilities as well.
Yes, yep. The closest one to you is immediately out in the hallway. In the first aid box out there, there's an AED as well as some other items in there.
Commissioner Green had a question?
Yes. Last night I watched a video where a person saved the life of a police officer who had swallowed something. What is the difference between swallowing something and you do the chest compression or someone having a heart situation?
So, again, swallowing something could lead to a cardiac arrest. If it was a poisoning, it could lead to a multitude of different, scenarios with the person. The CPR and the cardiac arrest, again, cardiac arrest is just the heart short circuiting. It's kind of quivering in the chest, not effectively pumping blood around. That's where the chest compressions would come in to get the blood circulated through the body. And then the AED would come in to kind of shock the heart back into its normal rhythm. So,
Okay.
That doesn't address the question of what if someone's choking, what's.
oh, if they're choking,
Yeah, if
that's
they're
gonna be
choking, that's what I meant.
a abdominal thrust to pressurize the chest to push that item out. If someone has passed out or lost consciousness choking, you would then resort to those chest compressions to push
Hmm.
that item out.
Hmm.
Same type of compression.
Okay.
So if they're choking, the chest compressions would dislodge.
If they're
potentially what-
unconscious, that's what we would do is the chest compressions to attempt to dislodge that item. Because you can't really do the abdominal thrust.
If they're laying on the ground.
Yeah, exactly.
Other questions, scenarios that you've encountered that you want to ask Craig about? How go ahead, Jeff.
Just as far as first aid kits and that, does every crew have first aid kits?
Yep, first aid kits, and then for high-risk jobs, chainsaw operations, tree trimming, there's also a tourniquet that goes out with that, so.
All of our vehicles have a first aid kit,
Okay.
so
I guess this was more my question,
Absolutely.
which was not worded very well.
that's just no problem.
We got there, we got.
We
where
got
needed
there,
to be.
yes.
And
thank
we
you.
do a dry run and we make sure all those kits are in the truck or equipment, depending on what we're doing the inspection on. And each department is responsible for doing that.
So that's one of the checklist things on dry run.
Absolutely.
I'm sorry, Joanne, go ahead.
Okay. So if you see if they're out working on the road and they see someone walking on the road and they fall down, our staff would go over there and help them.
Sure, so our staff is trained in first aid and CPR. First step would be to call 911 and then assist as needed, yeah.
Mhm.
yeah.
Because we're not worried anymore about getting sued and things like that.
No, we have what's called the Good Samaritan law here in the state of Michigan. So as long as you're practicing within the scope that you've been trained to, you are covered by the Good Samaritan law.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
No surgeries.
I was gonna say, keep your scalpel in the
Yeah.
car.
Tuck it
Okay.
away.
Great, thanks, Craig.
Thank
Thank you,
said
Craig.
the mannequins will be available at your,
At my cubicle on my desk. Yep.
okay.
All right,
Great, thank you.
thank you.
All right. Next on the agenda, we have a presentation by our engineering department, Nate Murphy and Aaron Burkholz on the Sharon Valley Bridge. Provide an update where we're at with that design process.
Okay, good morning. Yeah, good morning. Aaron Burkholz, Assistant Director of Engineering here at the Road Commission. And Nate Murphy, I'm Senior Project Manager for Design and Construction. We're here to talk about the Sharon Valley Road Bridge over the River Raisin, structure 11038, and give you an update on where we are on the design for that structure. Going back in time to when we started this project, we applied for funding through the MDOT local bridge program. This was back in 2021. And through that process, we were awarded 1.9 million for the replacement of the structure to be done for the fiscal year 2025. That award was including federal and or state funding sources. There's also a local MTF match. Oh, did we lose it? So we're currently working toward, the design for this one, the MDOT fiscal year is from October 1 to September 30. So we have to get these, monies obligated prior to the end of that season. And then we'd be, as long as we're obligated, we're working toward getting the MDOT, bid letting in October of this year. So, October 2025.
And for us, that obligation to the funds, we'll just say in general, that's when the money is secured. That's when the money is in the bank. And that occurs basically after we make our final submittal to MDOT, after we submit the final plans and proposal and estimate, is when MDOT, between that time and when the bid is opened, is when obligation occurs at MDOT. So again, as Nate said, this is fiscal year 25 funding. It can include federal and or state funding for this type of program. You know, there's a great need statewide for bridge funds. And I'll say, unfortunately, in my long career, that's been a consistent need. There's always been a need for bridge funding. We're very fortunate to have Nate here. Nate has a wealth of knowledge in bridge design and bridge construction. And actually, Nate also sits on the Regional Bridge Committee. And so his participation in that certainly aids our understanding of the program. So again, we've been fortunate to identify these funds. In my previous conversations with the board, I've made the point that bridges are very expensive endeavors. And so on this one, again, the award was for 1.9 million. If you were to, and we'll get into some pictures of the bridge, it's a fairly straightforward crossing on a country county road. But again, bridges are very expensive undertakings. So.
And I can add, as part of that application to MDOT, they split the application funding awards between on-system, just or less for us, it'd be primary roads, and off-system. So that'd be local roads for us, pretty much separates that way. And they've been asked to make sure 50% goes to each, because the off-system bridges are so, in so much need. So there's so much need out there for them, and there's no real good funding sources for them. So that was part of the reason why we got this one awarded, is we went after that other 50% of the award. So
Questions? Yes, Commissioner McCollum.
I'm just wondering, with the bridges, does it seem like some of the major roads were all put in at this sort of the same time? Was that the same with the bridges? Because it seems like across the country, our bridges are in trouble. I'm wondering, was it the same time frame they put them in?
largely when we look at that, we're looking at the interstate system, and that was built back after the war. So there was definitely a glut of them that came onto the system at that time, putting their end life at, similar locations. So, yeah, you could look at it that way. And the funding has just not kept up with what the need has been for that.
And I think on the local system, you'll see a variety of ages. So
Yes,
I don't recall what the age of this structure is, but it's
66, I think, is when it was built.
there you go. In particular, the local bridges, they discuss the challenges. But when you get a local award like this, it is a competitive grant. So we're competing with a region, and it's a tall task to get funding for these local bridges. And so it's like the golden ticket. So very rare opportunity. So this is a big award. It is a expensive project, and you can see even in the map there, you've got a closed culvert. That's what that triangle represents at Bethel Church Road. And then on Sharon Hollow Road, we have a load restriction on a bridge right in the area. So you can see just in the small area of rural Washtenaw County, there are needs, and there are needs all over our county for bridges. So we're very fortunate to get this funding.
Yes, and looking at that map, you can see the importance of, for emergency services. We were just talking about first aid and that kind of thing. But not having a crossing for that large of an area, it's a critical spot for response times.
Question, is this 80% federal, 80-20, is that?
Yes, so the award was, when we put in the application as part of the bait, as you might say it, to try to get us to be picked, we chose to go 80-20 split, so that'd be 80% coming from the MDOT bridge program and then 20 from MTF. That's what that last bullet is. And we'll talk about that in a minute, but the 20% is not a requirement. We do that to sweeten the pot. They do require 5% match. That's the minimum that you can submit for bridge applications on their program.
And then the estimate was submitted in 21, right? The engineers, so that's now 4 years old.
Yes, so it takes a long time to program these and do the design for bridges. With all of you'll see in the presentation, all of the different hurdles that we have to get over in the design. So they give that 3-year lead time to get through all the environmental requirements, get the design done. So there is a problem, as you noted, that was almost 4 years ago. The costs have increased a lot. That since then, there is that inflation that's happened, and it's not been normal inflation in the bridge world. It's been very steep incline. So
Yeah, and when we put together grant applications like this, it is more of a planning number. And then when you get into the design, that's when you really start to understand the complexities of the particular projects. And that's where you get a more refined estimate. And it is just an estimate until we go out for bid. And as they indicated, this was an award and we have to obligate in the fiscal year 25. It doesn't mean we have to go build the bridge, but we have to obligate the funds. Obligation means you've got the plans designed, you got the permits in hand, and you have the right of way necessary to construct the project. So all those 3 things have to be submitted to MDOT. They have to approve them. And then after they approve them, they submit the project for obligation. So it goes from planning dollars to actual construction dollars. And again, we don't ever see those dollars come to the road commission. It's administered by MDOT, and we submit estimates when we're constructing it, and then MDOT pays the contractor. And then we are invoiced for the local share, whatever that may be. And typically these award letters are capped. So it is 1.9 capped. So if there are additional costs, and we'll get into that as we go through the presentation.
Madam Chair.
Commissioner Green and then Commissioner Yamas.
So, I'm sorry, thank you. So we're responsible for the design, repair, and the construction of our local bridges. If someone is injured, motorist or a pedestrian, as a result of that design, repair, or construction, are we liable, or do we have some protection by governmental immunity?
It's a great question. We have MCRISIP, that's a Michigan County Road Association self-insurance pool. They would cover a lot of our liability. And that's where ultimately we as a County Road Association pool our money for those potential liabilities. There's always there's risk in what we do as far as liability, but we've been very successful at defending all the good work that we do and perform, that it meets industry standards and practices. We have professional engineers leading the way on the design, and then the contractors are required to carry insurances as part of the contract documents as well. So there's shared risk, but I feel like we're very well protected, and we're very well backed up by MCRISIP.
Thank you.
I'll also say that Matt pointed out that, this project having been identified for state and or federal funds, that MDOT, is the, agency that bids the project, that holds the contract for the construction. But ultimately, when that construction comes to a close, it's our bridge. We're the bridge owner.
Yep.
So, we ultimately bear the responsibility for the structure. We'll get into the presentation here and we'll talk about the steps we take with the current bridge to inspect it on a regular ongoing basis. But again, ultimately, we are the bridge owner, despite the new bridge being constructed under an MDOT contract. It still is the Washtenaw County Road Commission's bridge.
Right, and there's certainly, we take great responsibility, and that's where, again, we do the inspections and we do the load ratings, and if there's a restriction, we make sure, that gets posted appropriately for limiting the legal load that can go over that bridge.
So if there's a bridge, say that is deteriorating, and your inspection didn't catch the deterioration, and someone is injured, what's our liability there?
Again, I think as Matt mentioned before, it would be something that we would consult with CRISIP on. There's risk involved, whenever you have a structure that has deteriorated, but that's, where we consider that risk or try to lessen that risk is by, regular and thorough inspections of the structures. Basically, that's our effort to try to, lessen the risk of a structure like the existing bridge that's out there being limited at 20 tons. We inspect this bridge every 6 months. And so again, it's a repeated inspection, by, professional engineers, by a consultant who has a long history working with us and performing those type of inspections.
Yeah, so we not only have in-house experts that certainly review those inspection reports, but we have a consultant that specializes in bridge inspection. We hire for that practice, an outside agency. It's much like our auditors come in and look at our financials. We have a consultant come in, look at our structures and do a load rating and it's inspection and also load rating if required. And then Nate will review that as well. So it's a pretty well documented process and one that's required by law.
Because there's attention not only at the local level by the road agency, by the county road agency, but at the MDOT level and even at the federal level. Because this bridge is part of, how many federally listed structures do we have, Nate?
25.
125. So 125 federally listed bridge structures countywide that we're responsible for. And so again, not only are we attentive to and focusing on the regular inspection of those 125 structures, but MDOT is also on a statewide basis looking not only at their bridges that are under their jurisdiction, but also following up with the county road agencies, with the cities to make sure that those bridges are kept up. Because if a county road agency or a municipal agency fails to satisfy the requirements for bridge inspections, then you have the intervention at the federal level. And there's a long history that goes back to a bridge in Ohio in the 60s. And essentially what brought about the current bridge inspection program was a bridge collapse. And at that point, there was no orchestrated program in place at the federal, state, and local level to inspect these bridge structures. Unfortunately, it took the collapse of a structure back in the 60s that prompted that action to bring everybody under the umbrella so that there would be regular inspections of bridges.
Thank you.
Commissioner Yamas.
So to go back to, I was taking notes, MTF or MDOT pays out for the project after we have executed it, I guess. What I was asking is, you were talking, Matt, about we're obligated for the plans, the permits, and what else? The estimates?
So we have to design it, essentially complete the design that would include plans, specifications, and estimate.
Yeah.
Then we need to secure the necessary permits. In this case, it would be Eagle, Environmental Great Lakes and Energy, Department of Michigan for the water crossing and they'll get into the other specifics. And then we have to have all the right of way. So oftentimes if we're realigning the road, which is the case here, we have to then acquire the necessary easements or right of way for that project. So all that has to be submitted to MDOT for review and approval. And then ultimately the funds get obligated and then an agreement is generated between MDOT and the road commission, and this board approves those agreements on a regular basis. You'll see MDOT agreement and then contract and then number, and then it correlates to a project in our budget that's receiving federal funds. And that's really that obligation process. So
Okay.
to go from planning to construction dollars.
And then once we're into the construction phase of the project, Matt mentioned that we have inspection on the job site, full-time inspection with the contractor. That's both to ensure that the contractor is constructing the project plan specification and to document the contractor's work as it's being performed. And we process every 2 weeks. We refer to it as a pay estimate. That's processed. So as the contractor is going along and performing the construction work, they're being paid for that work. And basically that is submitted to MDOT. MDOT processes payment to the contractor. And then again, as MDOT is processing that payment, they're following up with us with an invoice saying, okay, we've paid the contractor, you owe us 20% of that. So,
Great. That answers my other question I had
Mhm.
about they control the payment.
yes.
And that's how they get the payment. Every 2 weeks, we send in the inspection of what's
estimate.
being done and the pay estimates.
Yep.
Okay, thank you. for
Yep.
Clarification.
No problem.
You're good?
Yep.
Good. Anybody else? We're all set?
Okay.
Move on. Okay, and so as part of, the reason why we put in this application was this bridge is functionally obsolete and structurally deficient. It was built in 1960. I said 66, I was a little bit off. 1960 it was built. The geometry of the road, meaning how the vertical curve, we call it, how you're going down the hill, and horizontally, the curves that you turn, is very, country-like. I don't know how else to say it. It's very, winding and, does not meet the requirements of the, AASHTO, which is the design board for, developing how the curve should be, does not meet that. The bridge is structurally deficient, and because of as a result of the deterioration of the beams. So the beams are, concrete beams that are existing, and due to the cracking of the concrete in the beams, they have been deemed as, deficient. And there's also an issue with the scour, I'm sorry. You can see it right on the left there, there's a picture, an aerial picture of the bridge looking down on it. You can see that as the river raising comes around that corner, the river is making that turn, and it causes scour, what we call it, that could happen around that bridge. And that also plays into the fact that we had required a 6-month inspection for the bridge. So there's functionally obsolete, structurally deficient. It does not meet the requirements for either of those. And that does present a liability as Rod was bringing up, that we have a bridge that doesn't meet those requirements. So we would, first we want to have a bridge that we're not keeping track of every 6 months. The failure that happened in Ohio mandated federally any bridge over the length of 20 feet to be inspected every 2 years. And so we really don't want a bridge that is needing to be looked at this often. So that plays into why we picked this one as well. There's a lot of factors that this one needs help with. And so,
Yeah, one other thing I'll mention is it wasn't uncommon in the past, in history, I'll say, looking back, where as they were constructing these bridges, they would look for the shortest span across the river. And they would say, okay, here's the shortest place to cross. That's the easiest way to get across. So we're gonna build the bridge here and then we'll figure out where the roads go. And so I'm guessing that's what, I don't know that, but that's my theory here. Because I'll use an engineering term, this bridge is very wonky. Like you should not, on the right, you can see the picture looking across the bridge, looking from the west to the east. When you see the other end of the bridge, you should not immediately see a curve. And that's where we refer to that big yellow and black arrow as a target arrow. That target arrow should not be there on a modern bridge. Again, for the time this was built back in 1960, they probably felt that it was sufficient. They're like, hey, this is a country road, like this will be fine. But again, as we now advance to, I'll say, more modern times, we really can't accept a bridge on this type of alignment. It really requires a lot of attentiveness on the part of the motorist to realize as they're coming down a steep hill and going across a narrow bridge that they need to make a pretty sharp turn right off the end of the bridge. And so we'll get more into the design, but again, functionally obsolete and structurally deficient are terms that we use within engineering. And we try not to get too far into the details, but we just kind of wanted to highlight that, so.
Commissioner, I'm sorry, Commissioner Green?
Yes.
Yep.
If someone exceeds the weight restrictions that are posted, is that something our ordinance officers attempt to enforce?
Yes. Yeah, so if we would have a weighmaster in the area and the weighmaster observes an overloaded vehicle, one that would exceed 20 tons, they can stop that vehicle and weigh it. But again, it's very difficult to catch that type of thing, particularly on a bridge that's located like this one out in a very rural area. Usually if we're going to catch an overload on a bridge, it's because it's been repeated over time. And we hear from the public that, hey, there are vehicles going across this bridge. They appear to be over the 20-ton weight limit. You might want to have somebody keep an eye on it. So again, there's that inherent concern that we have a bridge that structurally cannot carry current highway loads. And that's ultimately what we need. Even though this bridge is again in a very rural area, you want to consider there's a lot of agriculture in this area, and that equipment can get quite large. And we don't have a lot of crossings here. We highlighted that in the first slide. There are not a lot of east-west crossings here. Unfortunately, we have a closure on Bethel Church just to the north. And the next crossing of the River Rays into the south, you have to go all the way through the city of Manchester and go across the bridge downtown. So again, even though this bridge is in a country setting, it has a quite an importance to the area and being able to move around.
Okay.
Thank you.
Just to review, so that we don't use terms that you're not familiar with, this is what we refer to as the parts of the bridge. On the left, at the bottom, we have the abutment. So starting from the bottom, I should say, substructure is anything that is in the green there. So we have a abutment on the left and a pier on the right. And then, so we refer to those commonly as the substructure. Above that would be called the superstructure. So that would include anything that was from the substructure up. That would be the beams, the deck, and the railing. That's all referred to as the superstructure. So hopefully that'll clarify things if we use a term. This bridge, the replacement of it, the existing and the replacement will not have a pier, but this is just to show you the terms here. We would have a single span structure for this one.
A lot of our local bridges are single spans. An example of where we do have piers is Dixboro Road over by St. Joe's Hospital. That's probably our largest structure in our system, where we span over the Huron River there. It does have multiple piers. Yep. But most of our local bridges are single span, meaning you go from one abutment to the other and you clear whatever the water course is that you're going over.
To clarify also for weight restricted and bridge scour, weight restricted on this bridge, as I mentioned, is due to deterioration of the concrete beams. The other issue that I mentioned was the scour at the abutment. To clarify that, here's a picture. This is not our bridge, but this is just showing where scour has affected the function of the abutments. And closing this bridge, you can see the water action that is removed the backfill behind the abutment. And that is the concern that we have with this one, having the 6-month inspection cycle.
Yeah, so in an area where the river turns, much like the one that we're citing here, this picture illustrates the power of water, right? So the high water levels and the velocity of the water can really take a toll on a structure. And you can see the water got so high and the scour, as we call it, or it creates an erosion of the structures behind. This is even behind the abutment. And so you're eroding behind the abutment where the beams are performing, but then it risks that abutment, the integrity of that. So, and the abutments are basically like your foundation of the bridge. So if the abutment's at risk, a lot of times, some of our load limiting factors on local bridges are because of the condition of the abutments. So that's where scour can be very powerful, and that's where a lot of the guidelines, if there's a risk of scour, you have to look at it more often.
Did you have a question?
Yeah, so is this the bridge?
No, this
in
is
the
just an example.
Example of the power of
Oh,
scour.
power. Can you enlarge that picture? Oh, thank you.
Yeah, and this was like an extreme example. This really illustrated what scour can do to a bridge. There is not this level of scour at the existing bridge on Sharon Valley Road. But again, we just wanted to be able to draw attention to what scour is.
Thank you. Commissioner Green?
Yes, what is scour?
So scour basically is the action of water, the power of water. As it's going along that foundation of the bridge, it starts to pull material away from that area. And so ways in which we account for scour in new bridges, as new bridges are constructed, is we drive foundation piling. So one example, and we'll have some pictures of foundation piling, but essentially what you're doing is you're nailing the bridge into the underlying soils. So if there's soil lost around that abutment that's underneath the beams, you still have those pilings, those foundational supports to hold the bridge in place. But again, basically scour is the action, the power of water over time. It's pulling soils away from the bridge. And so at Sharon Valley, the existing bridge, as the river comes underneath it, there's a sharp turn. And so you see scour along the outside. We call it the outside of the current. Basically, it's working its way around and it's pulling that material away. So it starts to, we'll say it starts to erode and like undermine the bridge foundation.
Yeah, you'll hear the term erosion. That's the one that I often hear. And ultimately, that's what the effect.
Thank you. Great explanation. Thank you.
As we begin the design of the bridge, this was back about a year ago, we started the main part of the design. We have our consultant team that was brought on board. And as part of the first steps of the design was to find the geotechnical information for the bridge. That would be basically you're setting your foundations on soil, and you need to know what that soil is and what you can expect so that your abutment doesn't settle, doesn't move, it has the carrying capacity. You can design the foundation with the soil parameters that you have out there. So they start by doing what's called soil borings. They drive a casing down into the ground and they pull a sample, sometimes up to 100 feet. We did that on this one, down from the surface. And they analyze that soil boring to determine the parameters of soil. So there's different foundation types that you can use. We don't need to go wade into all of that, but you really have to know what you're dealing with when you're designing the foundation. So that's where we started. While we were out there, we did encounter on our artesian condition. And this was something that we had hoped that we wouldn't hit, but we were kind of thinking that we would because over at the adjacent structure that was built in 18 and 19 on Sharon Valley, about 3 miles to the west. There was also artesian condition. Artesian condition, that term is just underground water that has a pressure on it. So it's pressurized. If you puncture it, it causes water to flow rather than it's pressurized because the overlying surface is holding that in there. And as you puncture it, you're putting a straw in there and making water come up through the pressurized artesian condition. And so we did unfortunately encounter artesian on this one. We were concerned because for that structure, it did cost us quite a bit more money to build due to that issue. So we'll get into that issue as well. The day that we were doing these, they had what we wrote on here as a bubble adjacent to the borings. So often when you have a artesian condition, that pressurized water, if you puncture it, it starts moving underground and you don't know where it'll go. This one happened, sometimes it'll just come straight out. This one happened to move horizontally next to the bridge and then come up. And so we had some work that we had to do in order to stop that, because you don't want soils migrating without you knowing where they're going. So we had our consultant work on that to stop it. But that was a complicating factor that will play a big part in the design of the bridge. And we'll get into that more.
The advantage between Nate mentions the previous Sharon Valley Road Bridge was constructed in 2018 and 2019. Again, that's on a paved section of Sharon Valley Road, about 3 miles west of here, over near the county line. And in that case, Nate and I, neither one of us was here during the design phase of that project. I'll say we inherited the project. We came in and with both of us working together, we were able to carry it through and complete the construction on that. But the artesian was identified during the design, but it wasn't considered as closely as it should have been, in my opinion. Because I think once the construction started, they realized how great that artesian, that pressure was underneath, because they punctured it as they were constructing the foundation. And so then we had to work with the contractor to identify the means to overcome that. And we successfully did that, but it took time and it cost additional money. And again, that bridge, that additional funding, there was a share on that. Again, we had to pay a portion of it. We had to process a greater portion through MDOT. And so that took some convincing on our part to explain to MDOT about the artesian condition and why there was the additional cost needed. But the great advantage here is we went into this with our eyes wide open. We knew that there was the possibility that we would have the same type of condition here. And so we've accounted for that as we've done the design on this project.
Yeah.
Do you know what type of soil it is off the top of your head?
Here,
Sandy loam, is it clay, is it?
There's a lot of clay, there's weathered shale down there, but that's well below surface. I don't remember all
No,
the
it's
different
fine.
layers, but
Yeah.
yeah, there's a lot of clay out there.
Commissioner Green, I'm sorry, didn't see you.
No, that's okay. So typically the soil analysis takes place prior to the design?
Yes,
yep, that's right.
Yeah, because you need to know your bearing capacity of those soils. So it's a very important element in the design process in order that you can properly design the foundation and the abutments.
And there's different types of soils, and depending on the specific type, that will factor into, like when you drive foundation piling, that'll determine things like the length of piling that you need to put into the ground. So definitely knowing the type of soil you're dealing with ahead of time is a big factor in the design.
Following and along with the soil borings, we start working on our Eagle permit. And as part of this, Eagle required us to provide them several alternates to balance the environmental resources that they have out there, meaning their resources include streams, threatened endangered species, the river itself. So balancing what the impact of those, excuse me.
Wetlands.
Wetlands, yes, that's a big one. Balancing the impact to those resources is a big part of what they're after. And so they required us to provide them several alternates for the layout of the new bridge. One of them even being this one, and that is to put the bridge back where it is and keep the road where it is. This was not a viable option for the design. So this one was eliminated mainly because of as I mentioned before, we talked about the curves, both vertically, how it goes vertically up and down and horizontally, especially. You can see there on the east side of the bridge, very sharp curves.
You wouldn't have any impacts on the natural features. However, because of the funding does require us to meet a low volume Astro road standard, meaning that the curvatures need to be enhanced so that you're as described, you're not having to deal with all the challenges vertically and horizontally along with the bridge at the same location. So not a viable option.
Yeah, we're not trying to design this to like a highway standard. They have a low volume road standard that you can use for bridges such as this, where you have very few vehicles using it. Well, in comparison to what's on a highway. So they do relax those standards, but even in that, this one does not meet that requirement for the low volume roads. Alternate 2 is shown here. This is actually the one that our consultant and our team came up as the most viable. This would be to move the bridge just to the south of the existing, kind of flattening out those horizontal curves, making it more smooth transition between going, each direction. It gives you, it takes that sharp curve out, and you can see the bridge is wider. We'll talk about the cross section of the bridge, but it is wider than existing, and that's a requirement of that same standard. So we would be paving to the west. Purple shows the extent of the pavement, that would be the asphalt pavement. And then you have a small transition. The orange on each end would be a gravel transition back to the gravel road. So there's 300 to the west and about 500 feet to the east to get the traveler through the vehicle through those curves. So, we try to, when we have a project like this, MDOT will require us to get out of the extent of where we're trying to fix paved. Does that make sense? So the limits of the paving is set at where you're trying to improve the roadway.
Commissioner McCollum.
This may be a silly question, but why not just go straight across? Is it because the property?
So that was also an option. So I can look at that one here.
Oh, okay.
We did look at that because everybody would rather just drive straight. But this one had a lot of issues. So there was a lot more impact to wetlands. The bridge itself was quite a bit longer. And it's not actually detailed there how long the bridge would be, but because of the wetlands, it would have been a lot longer. And the location in the stream, it required a much longer span. And as we've mentioned, it's expensive square foot cost for bridges. So that played into it. Right away was certainly a big part of it. You would need to have condemnation on that northwest property. And so This one was a non-starter, from all the environmental issues. And that's the way we looked at it, and Eagle also agreed with us on that. They reviewed these and
I know Eagle doesn't oftentimes look at cost, but we have to. And that would, again, would be cost prohibitive.
And I'll say, as we provided these various alternatives to Eagle, they were reasonable in discussing them and recognizing not only the environmental impacts of a proposal like this, but the cost and then the property impacts. So actually, they were pretty good to work with through this. You know, they arrived at the same conclusion that we did, that the design that Nate showed previously, that was the preferred alternative. That was the best alternative we could arrive at for the replacement.
Commissioner McCollum, I mean, Commissioner Yamas, and then Commissioner Green.
The light blue, is that the aquifer, the water underground? Is that what that indicates?
no, that would be, impacts to wetlands.
Okay, thank you.
And I'm also to assume that the longer the bridge is, the more risky it is. Is that true or
It's
no?
more expensive. We can build it. It's just a lot more expensive.
I see.
The last option that they provided or required was to, more or less keep the bridge where it was, but then push it out put the curve farther to the east. And this one was also a non-starter due to the impact to the wetlands. This one, just did not, you'd be taking so much of the wetland, that they quickly ruled this one out.
Could you go back to the preferred alternative, just so you can think, everyone can see? Yep.
So this one balanced that environmental resources. So we put the bridge in a location specifically for where scour would be less of an issue. So as it comes around that curve there, they were able to place the abutments where the design for the scour was minimal. And because as you move it through the different locations in the curve, the velocity of the water changes and causes a different scour function. So they balance that, they balance the wetlands, they balance this balances right away a lot of it. There's not as much impact to both north and south. And so there's a lot of pluses to this one.
And as part of the design process, we haven't really talked about it, but we look at the hydraulics of the water course as well. That's a big part of the Eagle permit, is those hydraulics.
Yes. Yeah, the bridge would become, if it was not placed properly, it would become the choke point for the river. And then that causes issues on the river that the Eagle doesn't want, also causes issues to the structure, because you can imagine it becomes like a chute and the velocity increases. Okay, so we looked at these. We also, on the southeast quadrant, there was identified by Eagle a stream. You can see kind of in these pictures, that's why we show them, that it is basically a roadside ditch, but they identified this as a high quality stream. And so when they do that, then we have certain requirements that we have to meet in order to, because we'll be moving the roadway over top of where that high quality stream is, and
AKA ditch.
also known as ditch. Okay, we'll use the word ditch, that's better. And so we would have to relocate that ditch to the south, and that causes further complication of our.
Nate, was the reason they called a stream because there was water present
There's water
with
present.
artesian
Yes.
conditions and the water pressures? So you do have a constant water source, but it's very small. But they certainly, they look at that, and that's a lot of times, because oftentimes our ditches may not have water in them for the bulk of the year, especially the summer months. But in this case, I think some of the artesian conditions may play into their making that a stream rather than a ditch.
And a lot of this hillside that's coming down, if you, on the southwest quadrant of the bridge, There's a pretty steep hill that goes down there. And all along that hillside, water is coming out of the hillside. So it's either just running off of the field to the west, or it's just coming out of that slope. So it's water's everywhere out there. And we put a ditch there, and so I happened to go into the ditch.
Yep. As you would expect, it being a river.
Yes.
So there is a lot of,
Water goes
Yeah.
through the river.
there are a lot of low areas. Yep.
So, again, here's a quick look at the existing versus what we're calling proposed. The proposed bridge, you can see the geometry, the horizontal geometry is improved drastically for safety, for the user. And,
Also, having a hard surface to go through those curves, with it being a soft surface road, as we all know, and have driven on gravel roads, that cross slope changes over the course of the weeks between the gradings. With it being hard surface, it really can be super elevated properly, and you can navigate those curves with confidence, because you have a hard surface and the friction is going to be there to navigate you safely through those horizontal curves.
looking vertically, the vertical profile, this is a cross section of the road along the center line. And it's exaggerated, so it's stretched. If you took the actual curve and you stretched it, it gives the engineer an easier time of figuring out calculating elevation. So it's just a quick look at, we are smoothing out that curve. It's not that ski slope that you see there, but it's because it's stretched vertically. But you can see that if you've driven that road, it is much improved from the existing vertical curve.
Apologies, because for Nate and I, and even Matt, because he's an engineer as well as being a managing director, we look at this and it totally makes sense to us. We're like, yeah, oh yeah. But it's skewed because of the scale. And so the boxes going from the bottom to the top, that's 5 feet. So each box is 5 feet. So you have to think about, as Nate said, it's not a ski slope like it looks there. But again, we just kind of wanted to illustrate some of the design work that we do, that we work with our consultant on. And again, it's trying to smooth that curve, that vertical curve going from high to low, to smooth that, again, to the benefit of the motorist, to provide a safer means of navigating this bridge crossing.
And in this vertical profile, you also see we're managing the drainage as well. You see the ditches in dark blue and magenta, and you can kind of also see that the low spot is not where the river crossing is, it's actually to the east. So that helps manage the water, because we don't really want water on the deck of the bridge. We want it to manage that, and then also manage it how it gets to the river as well. So a lot of thought goes into this. So, well done.
This shows in the right-of-way impact, so all of them, for the most part, except for just that little corner at north side, they're all to the south. And that's to be expected from the existing road right-of-way is strange through here. You can see how it's changes angle multiple times here.
It's kittywampus.
Yeah, that would work too.
Normally, and again, that right of way generally follows the center line of the road. And because this center line is so out of line, basically the right of way follows that. So for us to smooth those curves horizontally and going back to that preferred alternative design, we have to acquire right of way along the south side.
You can kind of see it better on the screen behind you, but the light orange is the existing right of way, and then the green is what needs to be acquired. And again, as part of the obligation process, you got to have the design done, the permits in hand, and right of way acquired. So that's all work in progress. So they're hitting the major highlights here.
Yes, and so as part of this, you can see on the right is a picture. It's a pretty wooded area. But the layout, the way that we have it, we're only going to be impacting approximately 95 trees, which to me, I think that is pretty well balanced. And that will also open it up and keep the pavement more dry for the longevity of the pavement. Dries out, it'll melt the snow faster. It's just, it's much better for the road surface and the bridge surface to have it, for the longevity of it.
And again, as we talked about, as we looked at alternatives with Eagle, certainly one of the things that was considered was the number of tree removals needed, but that was only one of the environmental resources factored here. You know, we had to consider trees, we had to consider the river raisin, we had to consider the wetland areas. We also, which is common when we get into bridge construction, you have to consider the fish. You have to consider, this is an area of migratory bats and birds. So there's a lot of environmental factors that are considered when you're building a bridge. And again, Eagle was in discussions with us about this. So we're aware of the fact that 95 trees need to be removed, but again, all things in balance, this is the best alternative.
Don't forget the mussels in the
The
stream as
mussels,
well.
I forgot, we have mussels in this stream as well, yes.
It is a big issue when we're getting the Eagle permit. And Nate will probably get into that, I think.
Jeff?
Does the old road then just go back to green space afterwards?
Yes, so that would be, obliterated. It would just be sloped and planted with grass.
So it's just, it's a trade-off, really. It's not new. Sure. You know.
Yes,
It's a trade-off,
exactly,
yeah.
yeah.
Thanks.
It will still be public right of way, but without the road.
So those 95 trees can grow back
Yeah,
Over time,
over time.
yep.
Mhm.
Commissioner Yamas.
Yeah, so I just out of curiosity, so we'll be providing a new cemented entranceway. It looks like the property has a gravel road onto the road near the bridge.
We would extend the driveway, yes. So for the driveway, they're in that northwest corner.
Yeah,
Yeah, Nate's got that picture right there. So the lower picture shows that we would extend that driveway to that residential property so that, yeah, they have access. to
and we
the,
will make it
road.
cement. It's not cemented right now, correct?
I don't, Nate,
think
did
it
we
would be-
identify
I
that?
think it would be, HMA.
Hot mix
Okay.
Yeah,
asphalt. It
sorry.
would be an asphalt
Yeah,
driveway
asphalt.
approach.
Okay,
And it goes up to the right of way. It doesn't go beyond. It's weird because our right of way jumps to the north there. You can see, how it turns
yeah.
to the north. So that's why the driveway goes up that far, into that space.
And that's typical practice is if it's a paved road, we end up doing a paved approach. And we'll take care of it all the way within the public right of way.
So have we acquired the land yet? Or that's,
No.
will be in the process, right?
We're in the process of making a good faith offer. So ultimately what they do is they see, all right, this is the what we need to acquire. Then we have an appraisal. The
Right.
appraisal gets reviewed by another appraiser just to make sure it's current fair market value. And then ultimately we would, Kurt Brochet, that works with Nate and Aaron would make a good faith offer to the property owner. And then we'd, oftentimes they'll counter, and we'll review. And then ultimately it comes to the board for consideration and approval.
Commissioner Green.
So Eagle gets concerned with the amount of trees that are removed.
They do. That's one of the things that they would consider would be for a project like this. Among the many environmental resources here would be tree removals. Their primary focus there is migratory bats and migratory birds. So they would look at that, but again, that's in balance with, you have to consider the fish, the mussels, the river, the wetland areas. Those all are factors in identifying what the best alternative is.
In the thought of priority, the high priority on the stream or river, wetlands, and then obviously other environmental factors like threatened and endangered species that they were talking about. But it is a balancing act. When we're looking at new infrastructure, there's going to be an impact. So how do you best balance those impacts?
And this is, as we move forward into the design, this is a cross-section of what the abutment design would need to be. And this is just to illustrate the complexity of what we're dealing with the design. As I mentioned, that artesian issue that we found during the soil boring exploration, identified a pressure underground for that water that would result in a pressure head of around 18 feet above the existing ground. So that means that if you drove a straw into the pressure, there would be a point at which the top of the straw could be high enough that the pressure would equalize and the water wouldn't continue to come out. So what we're trying to balance is, while we're building this abutment, we can get the foundation substructure built without water going everywhere. So you can see here, if this is a cross section, so if you took a slice down the center of the road at the bridge, this, if I have a pointer here, let's see, does this work? Okay,
There you go.
so this is the abutment right here. This is a cross section of the concrete abutment. Underneath is piles, so there's steel piles. We'll talk about that in a minute. That's pounded into the ground.
And there'll be pictures.
Yes.
Yes, oh, yes.
This is very engineering-esque.
And again, it's just to illustrate the complexity. And then on either side, in order to hold this water in, we call it a cofferdam. There's steel sheeting, and we'll talk about that in a second with pictures. There's a cofferdam on either side. But the point here is to show that while we're building this, that we can contain the water in a way that is controlled, will not render the site just a total mess that we can't work in, and we can have control over what's being done. So and the start of the construction, and you would put these substructure units in. So you would start with getting the piles in typically. And again, every time you put something down into the ground, you're puncturing that artesian, or potentially puncturing it. We don't know exactly where it is. It's just it's down there. It's just, we don't want to have one of, like at the adjacent structure to the west, there's only one area that caused the artesian to come up. And we ended up needing to plug that so that we could then continue with the construction of the foundation. So anytime you put anything into the ground, that's a potential for where that could puncture it. And we did, as part of this design, I had hoped that we would be able to use a spread footing, which is just, if you can imagine, the word spread is just spreading the load over the top and not puncturing it. Unfortunately, the soils did not allow us to do that. But that was that's where I came in at. I was hoping that would be what we could do, and we wouldn't have had to deal with this at all. So there is a lot of complexity as far as how to build this. And this kind of talks to what that is. So what is a cofferdam? This is a picture at Dennison Road we built back in 21. You start by installing these interlocking steel sheets, and you pound them into the ground, and they all interlock, and they make a perimeter around where you're working. You can see here in the foreground, these guys are pouring concrete around these piles. So you can see the piles that have been pounded in to support the abutment. So you start with that perimeter sheeting in order to make yourself a dry work area. And again, every time you puncture it, that's a place that's potentially where you're going to be allowing water to come up. So that in this picture, this is the Sharon Valley Road Bridge to the west. You can see, looking from the aerial view here, there's two abutments. The easterly one looks nice and dry. The westerly one, you can see, is full of water at that time. And that's because that was leaking at the point that when this was taken, that artesian was bleeding up into the work area and filling that whole area, so that it was unable to be built. Then we eventually had a specialty contractor come in and stop that water flow. And this is a picture down after they had removed the water inside that sheeting perimeter, the cofferdam. They've successfully plugged that artesian flow enough to be able to continue their construction. Any questions on that?
Commissioner Yamas?
And just out of curiosity, I used to walk along the, I don't know, Getty's Road, that park by
Yeah.
Huron High School. They did this around there, right? Because I saw some of the.
There's definitely, cofferdams there. I think I wasn't here. You got to build that one.
Well, when we worked on the Dixboro Bridge years
Yeah.
ago, that's been 19 years ago now, almost 20 years ago, that we worked on the Dixboro Road Bridge, the big
Right.
bridge that's near WCC. But oftentimes you'll see that they'll put interlocking steel sheeting like this along rivers. Again, as again, it can prevent scour along a river, you know, where you're driving a long steel sheet into the ground, down into the soils to basically prevent that water from causing erosion along the stream bank. In the case of a bridge, you're creating that enclosure. You're enclosing an area so you can perform the foundation work. Again, reflecting back on the Dixboro project, that one also had artesian conditions underlying. And we factored that into the design, but also had to deal with them during construction. Because some similarities, it's interesting, as I think back on that project, there were areas there on Dixboro where the water would just come out of the hillside. And we see the same thing on Sharon Valley Road, where the water just finds its way out of the hillside. So, yep.
Commissioner Smers.
How many feet below the deck do you think you're gonna be with foundations on this thing? How far below?
How many
elevation?
feet below,
Grade.
for
Yeah,
the
like-
piles?
Yeah.
I don't have the geotech report finalized yet, they will be what we call friction piles, so they will not be, there's two different piles. So you have friction where, you're taking you're obtaining your structural support from the friction of the soil on the sides of the pile, or you can have end bearing piles, which would be if you drove it down and set it on, bedrock.
Or something.
So this one will be friction pile. I don't know what that pile, final depth would be.
Again, this was Dennison Road. And so if you look close, you can see some of the marks on those, we call those H piles. So again, those are friction piles and those are 70 feet.
All right.
So basically they start at the bottom of the pile and they start marking it off, I don't know, an 8 every foot.
Yep.
And so that way, as they're driving the piles, they can see how much they've driven. Because actually the way we pay for piles is based on driven footage. So they need to know how much they've driven into the ground. Plus, as far as the actual bearing capacity of a pile, there's an instrument that we use during construction called a saximeter. And basically the saximeter, the inspector's there and it's telling the inspector and the contractor what the bearing is of that pile that they've driven. That's a much more modern way to do it. We used to do it by blow counts. And so you would stand and there's a big diesel hammer and they put the pile up into the hammer and you stand there and you
Yes.
count the number of blows per foot. And that tells you what your bearing is. But a diesel hammer lets some diesel out. So as it's driving, there's little specks of diesel. And so again, earlier in my career, I would stand there and I'd wear a white hard hat. And at the end of the day, it was pretty much covered with diesel because it's coming out of the hammer as you're hammering the pile in.
My first
And it's
experience with
loud.
these. So,
It's wicked loud. Like basically you wear plugs and you put earmuffs over because it's quite loud. So, yeah. Fortunately, relative to the construction of the bridge, usually it's a relatively short-term process. So, yeah.
it's nice watching all the little rainbow specks in the water around too.
Another reason we do
Yes.
cofferdams, is so to
Yeah.
try to ensure that we aren't,
Don't let Eagle hear that.
yeah. Well, they know, it's
Thank
just,
you.
Commissioner Green has a question.
Is there a reason why these beams are shaped like this as opposed to simply being straight?
Yes, absolutely. So for this one, this is Dennison. You can see some of them are vertical in the back. And then some are what we call battered. They're at an angle. And so that is to resist a large part of it is braking force. So if you have a truck that comes up to the bridge and stops, there's a momentum that is transferred into a horizontal force in the abutment.
But I think Commissioner Green means the shape of the cofferdam.
They-
Why are the cofferdam?
Oh, I thought you were
sheets
talking about
shaped
the
that
pile.
way?
Oh,
I
Yeah.
wanted to know that.
Right.
okay. Oh, I'm sorry. I went off on the wrong.
Yeah,
I
why
got
aren't they just
excited. I was like, let's get into the.
Why aren't they like flat?
Because they're nerding out on it here. and loving
They're
it.
they're interlocking, so why are they like shaped the way that
So
they are?
you're seeing cardboard you know, corrugated
Corrugated.
cardboard,
Uh-huh.
that inner layer causes, it gives a rigidity, right?
Makes it stronger.
Yeah, as you know, back in the, I don't know, when they came up with that corrugated cardboard, but before that, it was just a hard piece of thick cardboard, solid. Took a lot more, thickness in order to get the stiffness that you'd want in a box. So they came up with the idea, well, I can put a corrugation in the middle, and what you're doing is you're, making it structurally, improved section using less material. So this one, you know, you're making it a much more rigid for horizontal. So you can see as you pound it in, it's needed to, support that soil or the water. And if it's just a thin sheet, as you get a thicker section, you're getting more, rigidity, flexure, ability to resist that horizontal force. Does that make sense?
You just
Thank
thought of the corrugated cardboard thing, right?
Well, it's the same thing.
Well, yeah, but you just standing here, you thought of that, right? That was really good. Yeah. I wouldn't have thought of that. Yeah, the corrugated cardboard thing. I think is
Plagiarism
really good.
in process.
And it's industry standard ultimately.
Yes,
Like
yeah.
this is typically, and a lot of the cofferdams, they end up removing, so they reuse these sheets. In some cases, in this design, and I think you'll point this out, we are having them leave it in place to help with the design as well. So some are put in place for temporary measure to construct that foundation. Some are left in place and cut off. And that's one of the design features.
Yes.
But ultimately, they are pounded, but they're also vibed into the ground. So the vibration gets them put into the ground as well. So it's a really interesting process. If you want to see it happen, we'll let Nate know.
Beautiful sound.
Yes.
Yes, quite.
Get you the proper safety gear as well.
Yes.
Commissioner McCollum.
Nate, your explanation for the other ones didn't go to waste. I wanted to know why they were like this and,
Yeah.
yeah.
They were really rough that day. They weren't very accurate. No, that was.
That day.
No, that absolutely there for a reason. And even the direction of the pile, you can see the I shape, we call them H piles, but it's kind of, if you look at it horizontal, it's H. That is the rotation of how that goes in is also structural.
I see that.
So there's different foundation types that actually turn them the other way to make them more flexible. So
Yeah, and these were H piles, and then I think if you go to the next picture, Nate,
yeah,
those were cast in place. They're round piles. So they use different types of piling depending on the soil conditions. So again, we do both.
Yep.
So, yep.
Magnificent.
This is from our design plans, just a picture, a more detailed picture of what the overhead view of the bridge will look like. You can see this would be the outline of the cofferdam. And then on each wing here, we have wing walls. We're gonna be leaving the sheeting in place, so it's gonna be double function. So the front area of the cofferdam will be cut down, but left in place. I'm sorry, the cofferdam only goes out to here. It's not huge. This is just the riprap, sorry, that's the stone.
Yeah, riprap is basically large stone that we put in. So
Yeah.
if you look at a bridge, a modern bridge, you'll see large limestone that's.
Go to the
put
next
in.
slide.
Yeah, do we
You'll
have one
see
in
it.
there?
Yeah, there you
So
go.
there we go. Yeah, there's and we call that large stone riprap. So basically it's large stone that's put in place. And that, again, it's protecting that foundation. It's protecting it from scour. Because as that water comes through the bridge, you're breaking that water up and you're taking the energy out of the water by making it run along that rough surface, that angular stone. So, pretty much that's every bridge I've built, Nate, we always put riprap in because you're trying to protect that foundation from the effects of the water. Yeah, and Nate mentions that we will leave the interlocking steel sheets that we refer to as the cofferdam. We will leave those in place. Some areas of the cofferdam will be cut off, so they won't be seen at the end of the project. Some of the areas will remain in place and they'll be able to be seen. But the idea in leaving them in place is we don't want to further disturb that underlying water condition. As you drive them in and then you start pulling them back out, you're just introducing additional risk that you're going to vibrate something loose, and then all of a sudden the water's going to start coming up. So, yeah,
Thank you.
yeah.
So yes, this is an elevation. So if you're standing down in the river and looking side of the bridge, you know, this is what it'll look like. We're gonna be using, concrete beams, so they're called bulb T, somewhat of a newer, well, 10 or 12 years old,
Newer in our careers, Nate.
shape, but this is a bulb T. This is Dennison Road. When they were placing the beams out there, we're proposing the same type beams. And this is that day that it was exciting. They fit them on there.
What was the length on these, Nate?
Yeah, this span was 94 feet, I believe. And the proposed bridge for this one, for Sharon Valley will be 73.
So a little bit short.
A little bit shorter, but it's
And you
very
can
simple.
see, like in the case, this contractor, E.T. McKenzie, we've built several bridges with McKenzie over the years. They use a trolley. So where the two individuals are standing there, they're standing on the trolley. So you can imagine they pick the beam up, the beam comes on a truck. And so they lift it off of the truck, they set one end on the trolley, and then basically it rolls across. And so just kind of, it's very interesting. Bridge construction has always interested me. It's just it's a unique undertaking. And the beams, you can kind of see how the beams look like they have a curve in them, and we call that camber. And so basically that's designed into that precast beam when it's built in the plant, is the beam has a little bit of a deflection in it. And then when you put the load of the concrete deck on top, the beam comes down and it settles into its final position. So, yeah,
It's a big day when you're setting beams.
when you're setting beams,
Yep.
everybody's on site when you're setting beams.
Absolutely.
So, yeah.
After the beams are in, then we add formwork on the left and reinforcement for the deck.
Yeah, so all the green in that picture is the epoxy coated reinforcing steel. So that green epoxy coating basically protects the steel from corrosion. And so there's an abundance of steel that's set in place as part of a reinforced concrete deck on a bridge. So,
And then the deck is poured, and they use a piece of machinery to help get the top of the deck smooth and at the right elevation, and it moves along from one end to the other on tracks so that they can get that top surface in a nice smooth, and it's got to follow the profile of the road that we want to create.
the pouring of this much concrete, because again, it's a fairly massive amount of concrete, even on a bridge that's relatively small. Because decks are typically what, a 9-inch concrete deck, the
Yep.
thickness of the deck would be about 9 inches thick. And so you have to be very mindful of temperatures. Anytime you place concrete, you have to be very mindful of the weather conditions. You don't want freezing temperatures. You don't want like high temperatures, like up above 85, and you don't want to get caught in the rain. And so there's a lot of preparations that take place, a lot of checking of the weather forecast. And for bridges that are constructed during the summer, oftentimes they'll do the bridge deck pour during the nighttime hours. And that was the case on the Dennison Road Bridge in York Township. They actually poured that concrete deck overnight because that's the cooler part of the cycle. So,
Commissioner Green.
So we use asphalt on roads.
yes.
I'm assuming asphalt will absolutely not work on a bridge.
No,
No, it will
will
not. No, and we do have, I think, maybe a couple bridges that were built in the past where they would set, they call them box beams. They would set box beams side by side, and then they would pave an asphalt deck over the top. That's a bad idea. I'm sure they had reasons for doing it in the past, but asphalt is inherently flexural. So asphalt moves a lot. Well, the bridge is intended to move as vehicles go over it. When you combine a moving bridge with a flexible asphalt, the asphalt immediately starts to crack, it starts to come apart, and it doesn't contribute structurally to the bridge. It doesn't make the bridge any stronger. And actually pouring a concrete deck on the bridge, that does contribute to the overall structural integrity of the bridge.
Concrete is a composite material. Our concrete deck is a composite material. So what we're taking into to build it, you can see the beams are not next to each other. Exactly. There's a gap. So we're asking that concrete deck to carry the load of the vehicles. So that means it's a structural element. And as part of that, you have to have a composite, which would be the concrete working with the ability of the steel to carry that load, both compression and flexural is what we call it. So the asphalt is not able to provide any kind of structural capacity for that.
Yeah, the asphalt doesn't have the rigidity of this structure where you've got the reinforcing steel, and concrete alone is a rigid pavement as well. So you combine those two, and that's really what gives it its structural component.
After the deck is poured, we move to getting the approaches in. This is again, the Sharon Valley Road Bridge to the west. They're preparing to put the approaches in. And then after that, we pave in the road, and this will be very similar to what the proposed bridge we're putting here for this one. It'll be very similar to how this looks.
So you'll see also you have approach slabs as well. So you have a concrete slab that right before the bridge deck and transitions to the asphalt pavement as well.
Got a guardrail,
Yep.
so considerable guardrail goes in, because again, you're protecting traffic that might leave the traveled way, go beyond that white line. You basically are redirecting that traffic back onto the road. That's the purpose of that guardrail, is to get that motorist back onto the road, back onto the bridge, because there's concrete barrier on the bridge. And for good reason. You don't want someone driving off the edge of the bridge down into the water. But where you have that transition, the end of that concrete barrier, we don't want a vehicle impacting the very end of that barrier. We actually call that a coffin corner. If a vehicle hits that concrete, it immediately comes to a stop. And that in all likelihood is going to kill the occupants of the vehicle. So there's a lot of thought and design that goes into the guardrail approaches to try to, as best we can, protect the motorists.
So current design status, you can see there's many challenging issues that we're working through currently. We have the MDOT GI, which is the grade inspection. It's basically a 30% set of plans for the bridge that we'll be submitting to MDOT for their review. They still check in on the design, make sure everything is according to standard. And we have a cost estimate currently of $3 million around that for this bridge. And that is well above the 1.9 that was in the initial grant award. We will be requesting additional funds from the local bridge program. We have already communicated with them that this is a possibility. We didn't know the number, but we knew that it was going to be higher than what the submittal was for the application. For that application, we use a regular average unit square footage cost that MDOT has used for years. They've dialed that in pretty well for their highway bridges. That gives you a pretty close estimate. But when you add in all of the issues that we have here, they're non-standard issues, that causes a lot more cost to be incurred.
And Matt had brought it up earlier that, when we make the application for this bridge was back in 2021, it's a planning number. And Nate mentions that MDOT has basically like a per square foot. If you're going to build a bridge this size, how many square foot is the bridge? Okay, this is the price you use per square foot in your application. And so it gives you a planning number. Again, we can't answer whether or not there's going to be additional MDOT funds that would be allocated for this. We've been very prompt in following up with MDOT to discuss the situation. That this bridge presents some unique challenges, and that drives the cost of the bridge up.
And I would say ultimately, even if the MDOT were to deny the request for additional funds, we would still recommend to push the project forward because again, we've got a golden ticket. $1.9 million of a award for a local investment into a bridge that is not, you don't get that very often, especially on the off system. So just because there's so many needs out there, we would absolutely, my recommendation would be to move the project forward. Now it would be a lot different percentage wise, but ultimately looking and forecasting 2 years out, I think that this is something, a worthy investment that we need to take advantage of. This almost $2 million of grants. So we will certainly keep the board advised. We will have our second quarter update in July. So we'll get through second quarter update and we'll certainly look at the projections for not only the end of the year of 25, but then we look at 26 and 27. So we'll have a better feel for where we're at from a funding perspective for this particular project, and we'll give you an update then.
And the one other point I'd like to make, and you're right, Matt, the opportunity that we have here to realize this much in a grant award, nearly $2 million, but also how long of an investment, the term of this investment. You know, a bridge, generally we're designing the bridge for like a 75-year lifespan. And you can push it beyond that with regular preventative maintenance. And what I have seen during my career, I mentioned earlier in the presentation, there's always been a lack of bridge funds, but also to the positive, I've seen a much greater attention to preventative maintenance on the county road agency level and even on the MDOT level. Early in my career, the thought at that time was you build a bridge, you walk away from it, over time it deteriorates, eventually the bridge is junk, and then you go back and you replace the bridge. That has changed over my career, where there's much greater attention to you take care of that investment.
It's an
And
asset management.
That's right. Asset
Extend that
management.
service life.
Yeah.
So ultimately, the existing bridge is built in the 60s. So we're, 60 plus years into this asset. We're very fortunate to receive funding where we can hopefully build a bridge that'll be, that 50 plus years into
Outlast
the
all of
future.
us.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
That's the reality. Yeah, for bridges, typically, you build it and it will outlast your longevity.
Yeah.
That's the goal, is to build to last. That's Nate's saying.
ETL.
Commissioner Green.
Is there any situation where township funds are involved in bridge construction or repair?
Yes, so if we weren't to receive this grant, then it's a local road and it boils down to, we have a local road program where we would put forth 50% and then the other 50% would have to come from the township. So can you imagine asking Sharon Township for $1.5 million just for the construction? Design engineering, construction engineering is considerable. As you can imagine, the cost of doing the preliminary engineering is quite extensive as well. So we're already into it for hundreds of thousands of dollars in the design process. So we would split that normally for a bridge project as well with the township. So this is a huge advantage to take advantage of the grant opportunity so that it's not a burden to the township. We don't have to ask the township for any funds because we have over 50% of the project coming from an outside source. Yeah.
For the project schedule, we did submit the Eagle permit. That was back in January. We'll be submitting here the MDOT GI shortly. That's for their review, 30% review. We'll be having a public meeting in July of 2025 this year. We have muscle relocation that'll also happen in July, as well as right-of-way certification. And the final submittal to MDOT will be in July of this year. We plan to advertise the project in August, so it goes to MDOT. They would advertise it, and we'd have a letting in October. So we'd have a contractor coming on board in October, maybe early parts of November, they would have their contract from MDOT. And then construction could begin, late this year if the contractor so deems there is some early work that would be needed for that foundation. And so some tree removals could happen. That would possibly happen this year. Largely, the work will be done in 26. That's the way that we see it.
We also have oftentimes some restrictions on schedule that comes with the Eagle permit. So sometimes they'll say you can't work in the water during these periods of time because of fish spawning. Then we have the bat restriction. You can only do tree removal from October to March. So oftentimes these contractor schedules are dictated by some of the restrictions are in the contract documents, which include the permits. So
And the construction, I'll say, that's listed there is not the duration of construction. What that is the potential window in which they would start the construction.
Yeah.
You know, I think, Nate, you know, looking at the bridge with the challenges here, what do you think the construction duration?
I think we could easily, the problem is there's that pre-work that's gonna be needed. There's some settlement that they have. Again, this geotechnical, soil issue. They're gonna be needing a period of time, and I don't know what that is, in order to get settlement out. So what we'll end up doing is adding fill on top of the existing, and that pressure adds enough to get some settlement out of that existing soil. That would be removed, and then you would build the bridge. So there's time where it'll just be sitting, but it'll be closed to do that. So normally a bridge like this, you could be done in 3 months, 3 to 4 months, I think, and
Maybe a little bit longer here with the preloading that they have to do to the soil.
yeah, due to the complication, it's gonna be longer than that, I think, so.
So we'll have a schedule more defined when we get the contract documents done in July. Kind of, hey, here's your window to work. We'll obviously put some restrictions on the closure, that you have a period of time for closure. But a lot of this work can take place without having to close the road in some aspects. Like the tree removal and things of that nature. We can have the road remain open, but then when we're doing some of the other work, it's got to be closed. So we're still sorting out that construction schedule. What typically we'll have is a progress schedule and a maintenance of traffic specification, and that really dictates to the contractor. All right, here's the constraints that you have to work within, and then they give you a price. Sometimes we're more restrictive, and that may drive price up. If we allow them to have a little more flexibility, that may keep prices down. So we do have to realize if we put too many restrictions, then the price goes up. Because they've got to do overtime or put more resources to accomplish it in a shorter duration.
And I just will point out the mussel relocation is exactly what it sounds. There will be individuals with expertise in mussels, and they will go into the river Raisin, and they will physically pick the mussels up and move them somewhere else in the river.
I was
So
gonna say,
that
where are they gonna put?
They put them somewhere else.
Hopefully downstream.
So that we don't impact them as part of our work. So
Okay.
it's pretty interesting. Yeah.
Madam Chair.
I'm sorry, Commissioner
okay.
Green?
The letting refers to bid letting.
What's that?
The
Oh,
let-
the letting, that would be the bid opening.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Right.
so the letting is the bid opening.
Right.
Yeah.
So are we mandated to accept the lowest bid?
That would be up to MDOT. So essentially what MDOT determines, you know, Matt mentioned earlier that we enter into an agreement, the road commission enters into an agreement with MDOT prior to the bid opening. That comes to the board. And it's defined in detail in that agreement, but essentially it's up to MDOT to decide who the qualified low bidder is. So
Okay.
on a project like this, the bidder is going to have to be pre-qualified by MDOT for bridge construction. So, you know, that somewhat thins out the number of contractors who would bid a project like this. But yeah, MDOT reviews the bids and then they determine who the qualified low bidder
And
is.
ultimately, it is the low bid, but it's the low bid of the qualified bidders. If the bids come back substantially higher than the engineer's estimate, they will check in with the local agency. So if it's beyond 10% above the engineer's estimate, then they're gonna come back to us and say, are you willing to accept this additional cost? And typical answer is yes, unless there's a circumstance where, well, hold on, we've got to rethink this. We may have to rebid it or change something substantially and then make that change and then re-advertise and rebid. Usually that's not the case, but I have seen where bid prices come in, as Nate mentioned, bridge work is expensive and volatile when you talk about inflationary costs. Also, it depends on the amount of work going on in the state. If there's a lot of bridge work in the area, the availability of contractors does drive costs up. So it's that simple supply and demand. When the demands are high, supplies are low, costs go up. So we'll see where we're at. Hopefully we get favorable prices, but if not, they come back to us, say, are you willing to accept this price, the cost of the low bid, even though it exceeds the engineer's estimate. So that usually is made by staff, and then we would advise the board and make the necessary budget adjustments if that were the case.
Did you have a question?
I'm just concerned about the terraforms and the cost of steel. And so that would be the only thing. If the prices are so extreme, you'll come back to the board, or will you make the decision on if the bid is doable or not doable?
Yeah, usually that comes from staff, and ultimately I'll work with engineering department to make that recommendation to MDOT. If it's significant, meaning we're hundreds of thousands of dollars over, then we will have to advise the board and we've got to make a budget adjustment. But typically we're within that realm. And again, a lot of this is timing as well. And we've got to spend these funds in the time frame. So we do have some constraints to think about in that regard. But we will certainly keep the board well advised with this project, because it is a significant one. And I would like to thank the team for preparing this presentation, because we felt like this is a very significant investment and we want to keep you advised, because it's not normally the local share on this project may be significant, but hopefully we're able to get additional funds with our MDOT request.
Thank you. Great presentation.
Very
Any
nice
other
presentation.
questions?
Yeah.
Good.
Okay,
Okay.
thank you.
Thank you. All right, we're going to take a 10-minute break here. This clock. So everybody back, if you can, as close to 11 o'clock as possible. Good. Okay. Welcome back, everybody. We're going to go ahead and proceed with our agenda, and I will turn things back over to Mr. McDonnell, Federal Aid Project List.
Thank you, Chair Fuller. Thank you for all the great discussion and questions on the last presentation. We were a little longer than anticipated, but this should be fairly short. I'll invite Aaron Burkholz back up because I'm sure there'll be questions, but ultimately there was a desire to present the projects that we have in the next few years that involve federal funds. So a lot of these projects are programmed through the Washtenaw Area Transportation Study, which is WATS. And ultimately, a lot of these are through the TIP, the Transportation Improvement Plan, that they manage along with SEMCOG. So WATS is very unique, where they're a subset of SEMCOG, our Metropolitan Planning Organization, and they kind of carve out those funds for Washtenaw County, and we manage those funds with our partners in Washtenaw County, the other eligible agencies, which typically will include the cities. So we do program those funds. And then also on top of what we talked about this morning, there are also competitive pots of money for various purposes. One of them, the bridge program, another being congestion mitigation air quality. You'll see it abbreviated as CMAQ. The TAP funds, Transportation Alternative Program. That is something we typically partnership with our township partners on. There are safety funds. Again, safety is a competitive grant program as well. We also have one other competitive grant is the carbon reduction. So you'll see the abbreviations on the funding source. The way that this is laid out for you is first it's organized by year. So we have the various fiscal funding years, and as Aaron had mentioned, MDOT fiscal funding year, to make it more complicated, is from October 1 or they start October 1st to September 30th. So their fiscal year's slightly different than ours. Ours is the calendar fiscal year. And then further complicate, a lot of our townships and cities operate fiscal years starting July 1. So when you toss fiscal year, you kind of have to know who you're talking about. So when you're dealing with federal funds, the fiscal year is October 1 to September 30th. So we're currently in the 2025 fiscal year, and we have a lot of these projects already obligated, meaning they're through the bid process or going through the bid process. As we share with you, Sharon Valley is on the list. So it's fiscal year, then alphabetized by road name. And then it gives you the project limits, the township it's in, the type of work we're doing, the funding source, the length of the road typically, and then a breakdown of federal, state, and local. That local match is typically us. Unless it's a TAP project, then it's the township, and then a total construction cost. When we're talking about dollars, we're always, in this case, referencing construction costs. We do have to recognize that all these projects have costs, which a lot of times in the industry will be soft costs, which is, preliminary engineering, right-of-way acquisition, and then construction engineering, materials testing. So those are all costs, and those can range anywhere between 15 to 25% in addition to construction costs. On the smaller jobs, like mill and resurfacing, the engineering is fairly not that consequential. On a job like the one that was presented, engineering is substantial. So the list here, again, 25, a lot of these funds are either obligated or in the process of being obligated. And then the future funds, you can see 26, 27, 28, and 29. Those change over time, meaning we may make changes to the funding amounts, the costs of construction. We may be successful in adding to. Really, our goal as an organization is to bring as much into Washtenaw County and investment into our road and bridge network as possible. So we do that by applying for all these funds. And as you can see, the total on page 3 is substantial. So we are looking at improving between 25 all the way to 29 over 100 miles of road length, which would equate to approximately $42 million of federal funds, $500,000 of state funds, and then our local match would be roughly 10 million, a little over 10 million, for a total of almost just over $53 million of investment. So that's a huge number, but keep in mind, our needs are well beyond that. So when we look at all of our needs throughout the county, it's not tens of millions, it's probably hundreds of millions. So this is just a piece to that puzzle. And these federal funds, oftentimes, non-bridge are being invested into the primary road network. That this does not get invested into local roads unless there's always an unless or but, because bridge funding does allow for investment to off-system bridges like Sharon Valley Road. So I wasn't gonna go into great depth, but I wanted to provide you an update and certainly, there's a lot going on in DC. But what we know to be true is that 25, we feel very confident that, bless you, that these funds will get obligated and, we'll be well on our way into construction by the end of the year or sooner. 26, I don't anticipate significant changes. There are some questions in some of those funding categories, like carbon reduction. But we're hopefully gonna get more clarification as time goes on in the coming months. Right now, the good news is, we've received word from Watts and SEMCOG and MDOT that, the various tip amendments, so throughout the year, we're amending the tip, with various changes, are moving forward. So there was not, a significant review done by Federal Highway. There was some concern about that. They are processing tip amendments, as usually we do throughout the year. So that's where we're at right now. We're continue to monitor closely. We were attending Watts and SEMCOG meetings, and they keep us pretty well informed along with MDOT. So any questions on the list and what's being presented?
Commissioner Green?
Is it a correct understanding that each of these projects must be approved by SEMCOG?
Yes, so they are approved in the tip. So a lot of these are already in the tip. And then once they're in the tip, that planning is set. And then, as I described, then it's up to us to submit to MDOT those plans, specification, permits, right of way, and permit, all go to MDOT, and then it goes from planning dollars into construction agreements and contracts.
And it starts at Watts, pre-SEMCOG, right?
Yes, so Watts will be the first step in the process where Watts Technical reviews it committee. Then it gets recommended to policy. Then policy moves it on to SEMCOG. SEMCOG, it goes to the TCC committee and then the General Assembly. So it's lengthy, but there are certain advantages for us because on the competitive grant side of things, we compete in a much larger pot with the SEMCOG region. So we compete with CMAQ, with carbon reduction. Those are larger funding sources. So we have the advantage of being a part of SEMCOG to go after additional funding revenue. So that's a good thing, but the bad thing is it's a little bit lengthier process to make changes to the tip. But the good news is we're ultimately very plugged into that process, understand it does take time, and make sure that we're aligned with their schedules so that all the changes occur prior to us submitting to MDOT. So all those things have to line up. When we submit something, it's got to line up with the planning dollars that are planned for the project. So if there's a change, we need to make that change well ahead of submitting to MDOT. The worst case scenario is then you wouldn't be able to obligate those funds because the two don't line up, what you submitted with the planning numbers.
And Matt, please describe who from this organization sits at Watts.
Sure.
To monitor this all along the
So
way.
Brent and Aaron Burkholz, Brent Schlack, our county highway engineer and director of engineering, and then Aaron Burkholz is the alternate for the assistant director of engineering at Watts Technical, Watts Policy. I sit, and my alternate is Barb. And then at SEMCOG, Watts attends. I know Commissioner Green, you attend as well as part of that group, and then we'll attend as well. Typically, some representative from the engineering will go to the TCC SEMCOG meetings. Generally, don't go to the General Assembly meetings because that's essentially they support the recommendations of the TCC at SEMCOG.
Thank you.
Problem.
Commissioner Yamas, did you have a question? I saw your hand wave. I don't know.
I do.
What that meant.
Well, I was wondering, could you please give me at a later date, a definition of what all these, acronyms are?
Sure.
I'd appreciate that.
Yeah, we
and-
can do that. We'll get that and we'll send it to all the commissioners. So
I'd
'cause,
appreciate that.
that-
And so for those that are obligated, there's no way to tell which one of these are obligated?
we can let you know, what funds, what projects have been obligated this year, and
Okay,
what's are to be obligated. Essentially, when you get your MDOT agreements, you can look through and look for job numbers and we can also add the job number. That's the way we keep track of things. So all
okay,
these projects have job numbers
right.
associated and that job number gets referenced in the MDOT agreements. That's how we kind of keep track of things. But the job numbers don't mean a whole lot to this board. So we didn't list it as a column. Try to simplify it. The spreadsheet that we get from Watson SEMCOG, it would go this long.
Yeah,
It would be a huge document. So we narrowed it down to what the most relative things were so that it's a little more easy to digest.
okay, thank you.
You bet. So STP is Surface Transportation Program. And then there's a urban area and a rural area. So STP is Surface Transportation Program. And then rural is just by definition. We have an urban area. There's an urban boundary that gets evaluated every 10 years with the census data. And then it's approved at Watts and SEMCOG. So that those urban areas typically will receive more funding, but then we also share it with a lot of folks. So City of Ann Arbor, City of Ypsilanti, City of Saline. So those urban funds get sliced and diced. The rural funds, that's only road commission, but you receive less funds. It's usually a little over $1 million a year, whereas urban gets about 4 million. And again, that's just, it sounds like a lot of money, but when you're doing road construction, it doesn't equate to a whole lot. The needs far exceed the funding available, so. And so that's some of those acronyms. And then they have different categories, the flex and the, but we'll get you a little bit more definition of what those acronyms stand for. That's a great comment. Thank you.
Yeah, and Matt mentions that the Transportation Improvement Plan, the TIP, we're nearing the end of the current TIP cycle. That goes through 2026. And then the next TIP cycle is 2026 through 2029. There's an overlap here. So 2026 is the overlap year between the current TIP or the old TIP and the new TIP. But we've submitted our jobs for the new TIP from 26 through 29. And that's what's indicated on that spreadsheet. Those are included. And again, in the out years, sometimes what we're able to do is we don't know specifically, or we don't want to yet identify specifically where we're going to apply the funding. Like Matt mentions, the surface transportation, the STP, we know that we're going to use that for like mill and resurfacing. And so we want to wait another year or two and get those updated PACER ratings to say, okay, this is where we're going to apply that funding and this is where we're going to apply that funding. But there are constraints on that. We're allowed to say that we'll use it on a countywide basis, but only to a point, and then we have to identify the projects by name.
The current couple of years, they want everything named. Where is it going? Not a countywide resurfacing program. So as the fiscal year gets closer, within 2 years, we're naming all those projects. And when we do submit that next tip cycle, you'll hear things like the federal aid committee. So I failed to mention there is a federal aid committee at Watts as well that goes through and looks at all the applications made of projects that end up in the tip. So then the federal aid committee will make a recommendation. Usually this only occurs every 3 to 4 years, where the federal aid committee will meet, make the recommendation to Watts technical then approves it and sends it on to policy and SEMCOG.
And we have someone at that table.
Yes, generally speaking, it's a director of engineering, county highway engineer, and then the assistant director is the alternate or myself.
So this is really easy. It's really black and white.
Right. Very straightforward.
Yeah.
Yeah, and a lot of all these meetings are all public meetings, but it's very difficult for the public to understand these processes and how you get into projects in the tip. We also have in the planning world called the long range plan. So that's the 20-year look. All right, so the long range plan, typically projects are all listed. And then in general speaking, when a new tip cycle happens, we look at the long range plan and we move projects from the long range plan into the tip for the short, think of it as a short range plan, the next 4 years, what's happening. So that's really what ultimately in 2026 is that crossover year where we're finishing the last year of the current tip and it ends up being the first year of the new tip. So that's where we're at. So we do have a fairly long list that we've provided you. Normally it's a lot shorter. And throughout the process, this is all under the assumption that everything at the federal level is going to get obligated under the budget. So a lot of times when there's budget discussions in Washington, they'll do these continuing resolutions in order that the transportation side of things can continue to move on. If there ends up being a stop, that means federal funds are stopped from being obligated. So there's a pause. Usually that pause doesn't last very long, but we are dependent on what happens in DC to make sure the flow of the transportation dollars continue. Very rarely have I ever seen it where things that are in the tip don't get done. They eventually get done. But I've not in my career over 20 years seen funds get pulled back. They may get renamed, like a funding source like carbon reduction ends up being something, name it something else, like CMAQ and carbon reduction are very similar programs. It may get renamed, but the funding generally doesn't go away. So that's just my 2 cents on the matter. We continue to monitor things closely, and we are absolutely what happens at the federal level is it does impact us. So we have to be very aware. They have to approve their budgets in order for these projects to move forward. So we will continue to keep our ear to the ground and keep connected with Watts, SEMCOG, and even some of our representatives in Washington, DC. So.
I also do want to note and give credit to Michelle Ford, our senior project manager, one of our senior project managers. Matt mentioned that the spreadsheet that comes from Watts is very long and it has so many categories, it's very difficult to read and decipher. Michelle actually offered to take that and to boil that down into the spreadsheet that's been offered for you today. So credit to Michelle for that.
Yes, Michelle.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you, Michelle.
So Michelle oversees our traffic and safety group, which is a lot of these funds are competitive grants from traffic and safety. And she worked in project management for a long time, managing a lot of different funding sources. So she's got some good skills in that arena.
Yes, very much.
Yeah. All
What do you
right.
want to tell us, Aaron?
Matt wanted me to come up here.
I just know that there's always a question that I rely on Aaron. Like, I don't know the specifics to that project. Come on up.
Yeah.
So,
And Matt, he covered everything, and really a lot of it is with these being federal funds, there's strings attached. And, we talked about that as part of that Sharon Valley Road Bridge presentation, that there are the steps that are needed that you have to go through, and you have to follow the MDOT schedule for that. So it presents a challenge, but you look at the amount of federal dollars that we potentially would receive versus what our local match is, and there is an advantage there. MDOT for a couple of years here in recent history, did offer the federal aid buyout program. And I'll say in particular, not just for us, but in particular for smaller road agencies, that's quite attractive because based on the staff that they have at a small road agency, it can be difficult to deliver federal funds. Unfortunately, that federal aid buyout program is not available at this point. MDOT has indicated they don't have the funding to participate in that. And so we continue to await maybe in the future some change on their part where we can participate in that again. Because there are advantages to that as well when we're able to take that federal aid buyout.
And as Aaron mentions, there are a lot of strings attached, so we have to be very strategic on what we're applying for and what the scope of work that we're going to go perform. We've mentioned in the past, if we were to reconstruct a North Territorial with federal funds, you would have to have 6 to 8 foot shoulders, which would change that road dramatically. And the cost of that would be very substantial. So sometimes we choose to use millage funds to invest in certain primary road corridors because it makes more sense. There's less strings attached, and we can still accomplish the work, the good work that needs to be done on that road without having to widen it 8 feet on both sides, which would be a big impact. So you have to be very thoughtful on what you're programming and what particular strings and rules that apply to that funding source. So we're very fortunate to have the engineering department that are experts in that arena and to be able to manage both the millage and our MTF investments and our federal investments. So we're well positioned to be able to take advantage of all those things. With that, that's all we had.
Any questions?
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, thank you. Dan, was there anything you wanted to mention here? Maybe later?
Taking it all in.
Okay, all right. Great, okay. Nothing else, Matt? All right,
Not this time.
if there's no other questions or anything to come before the working session, may I have a motion to adjourn?
Support.
Aaron, if you would please call the roll.
Commissioner Joy McCollum.
Yes.
Commissioner Gloria Yamas.
Yes.
Commissioner Rod Green.
Yes.
Commissioner Jeff Smurs.
Yes.
Commissioner Bart Fuller.
Yes. Working session is adjourned. We will see everybody back at 1 o'clock for our regular session this afternoon. Thanks, everybody.